Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Stone Warriors, Damian, by D.B. Reynolds, narrated by Tor Thom. Chapter 1. Somewhere in the American Midwest, present day. Cassandra Lewis raced down the deserted street, her booted feet slapping on the wet pavement. Gripping her right arm hard to hold back the dripping blood, she dared a glance over her shoulder. There was no one in sight, but all she could hear were the echoing howls of the hounds on her tail. She swerved to the building on her right, stumbling over the short step up to the sidewalk as she went directly to the big plate glass window. Wincing, she lifted her gun and fired a single shot. A crystal snowflake of cracks spread outward from the small hole. Stepping back, she aimed a hard kick at the weakened pane and broke it inward, before leaving a bloody handprint on the shattered glass, hoping to mislead the hounds and give her an extra few minutes. It wasn't much, but it was all she could do. She ran across the street, stepped up to the security pad on the Coleman building, and entered the code she'd paid the daytime guard for just a few days ago. The lock buzzed and she opened the door, entering quickly and closing it behind her. The Coleman was an institution of sorts, a 5-story building that had once been the center of the financial district. The big banks had all moved to the new high-rises downtown, taking most of the smaller businesses with them. But, as with all of the other buildings in this part of town, the Coleman had been repurposed. Some had been converted to light industry. Others now housed a growing number of the city's burgeoning wholesale fabric suppliers, while the Coleman itself had been divided into separate office suites, which were leased mostly by lawyers and other young professionals who couldn't yet afford the high rents that went along with high-rise buildings downtown. For Casey's purposes tonight, the Coleman was perfect. The building's occupants had all gone home long ago. It had an elevator that went all the way to the roof, and it was close enough to its neighbors that she might be able to make her escape over the rooftops, high above the pursuing hounds. She ran into the elevator and punched the button for the roof, leaning wearily against the back wall, scowling at her reflection in the polished doors. She was dressed all in black, combat boots and fatigues, her T-shirt torn and bloodied over her wounded shoulder, exposing the gory proof that she'd been shot. She swallowed hard at the sight. She'd seen injuries before, had even seen bullet wounds, but never on herself. She forced herself to stop staring, to take stock of her situation. She popped the magazine on her 9mm Glock, 5 rounds left and 1 in the pipe. Not nearly enough, especially not shooting with her left offhand. She reached automatically for the spare mag in the right-hand pocket of her black fatigues and closed her eyes in pain as the movement jarred her injured shoulder. Christ, that hurt. She'd never been shot before, and now she was pretty sure she'd been shot twice. After the first bullet, it had been simply all pain, all the time. She couldn't really tell if that second shot had actually hit her or just skimmed by. As the 4th floor lit up on the indicator, she dropped the nearly empty magazine into her left pocket and inserted the new one with a hard slap that made her breath catch in her throat. That gave her 34 rounds, and it still wasn't going to be enough. Not against what was chasing her. Hellhounds. She hadn't expected that. Fuck. She hadn't expected any real resistance tonight, much less a magical defense worthy of a full-on sorcerer. It took serious power to call up a pair of hellhounds, and it made her wonder if her enemy tonight was more than some random magic user. The talisman, the thing in her backpack that had started all of this, could be a powerful weapon, one that a sorcerer like... She hesitated even to think his name. But damn, Sotiris would love to get his hands on the talisman. Was that what was happening here? Had their ultimate enemy been behind this all along? Sotiris was possibly the most powerful sorcerer left on Earth, and unfortunately, he was just as evil as he was powerful. Keeping artifacts like the talisman away from him was a big part of why her boss, Nick Katsaros, and the rest of the FBI had her hunting them down in the first place. The elevator doors opened on the roof to a slab of cold, damp air, and the baying of the hounds. Did they sound closer? Shit. Ducking outside, she made a dash for the big air conditioning unit and hunkered down in its shadow until she was sure the roof was empty. This was her last chance. She had to make it work. With the Glock in her left hand, she slung her backpack over her right shoulder, ignoring the stab of pain. It might have made more sense to dump the heavy pack, but it was the talisman that made all of this mess worthwhile. She'd abandon her gun before she'd leave behind that damn pack. She rushed across the roof and peered over the front edge of the building, bracing her bloody hand on the Common Guardian, a statue of a half-naked warrior, standing guard with a knife at his hip and a huge sword gripped before him. The statue was a landmark, reputed to be a few centuries old. The warrior it depicted was supposedly life-sized, assuming the man was about 6.5 feet tall and built like a fucking god. Leaning forward to scan the street back the way she'd come, she gripped the statue's thick arm. Grit slid beneath her fingers to mix with her blood. "Looks like it's you and me, big guy," she muttered. "How about breaking that big-ass sword of yours loose and giving me a hand?" At that moment, her pursuers came into view. A dozen or more guards spread out below with a pair of hounds. That was actually the good news, that there were only 2 hounds. The bad news was that they'd caught her scent and were baying the message, letting everyone know about it. She still hoped her trick with the broken window across the street would misdirect their hunt for at least a little while. But in the long run, they'd find her as long as she remained on foot. She needed a vehicle, something to cut off her scent trail and quickly get her the hell out of Dodge. Stepping away from the edge of the roof, she paced from side to side, eyeing the distance between the Coleman building and its neighbors. She'd miscalculated. Down on the ground, the roofs had seemed so close together, but up here, with the pavement yawning more than 5 stories below, she couldn't make that leap. Maybe if she'd been in top form, if she hadn't been leaking blood and running for her life for the last couple of hours, she could have done it. But not tonight. She was going to need a new plan. Going back to the front of the building, she knelt once more next to the Coleman Guardian, where she could keep an eye on her enemy. She dropped her backpack to the roof and zipped it open, gently pushing aside the silk-wrapped bundle of the artifact she'd stolen. She pulled out a coil of rope and eyed it, mentally calculating whether it would be enough. Looking over the edge as she prepared the rope, she muttered to herself while working out her escape. She'd wait until the hounds had followed her fake trail across the street. Once they were in the other building, she'd run to the back of the Coleman, rappel off the roof, and make a run for it. For the first time, she wished this part of town were more populated at night. It would make it much easier to steal a car if there actually were some on the street below. But she might as well wish for the big statue to come to life. This time of night in this part of town, no one was here, except for the occasional security patrol. And since she'd timed her little burglary to avoid these patrols, they weren't going to do her much good. It was ironic, really, because she'd run this way on purpose, wanting to avoid civilian casualties, or even too many eyes seeing things they shouldn't. Those hounds, for example. They weren't anything like ordinary dogs. One look at their red eyes and 3-inch canines would have had sensible people running for their lives. But there was another reason to choose this isolated part of town, and that was to avoid the dreaded oddball with a phone camera. The last thing Casey or anyone else wanted was for her to end up on CNN. Crossing to the rear of the building, she tied her rope to a heavy piece of equipment that seemed to be securely bolted to the roof, then fed the rope over the edge and watched it fall down the side. "Fuck," she muttered. It was going to be hell itself getting down with her bummed shoulder in the heavy pack, but to make matters worse, the rope wasn't long enough. She peered over the edge, trying to judge the distance. It was difficult to tell in the dark, and she didn't dare use a light. but she guessed there was a good 12 feet of free fall waiting for her. She studied the ground behind the building again and noted some construction debris from the next building over, with a big dumpster filled with old drywall and other materials sitting right at the corner of the common. It wasn't ideal, but it had to be better than hitting the hard pavement from 12 feet up. She just hoped there wasn't a lot of nails or whatever in all of that debris. Securing her gun in her shoulder rig, she untied the rope, moved it to a point closer to the target dumpster, and then pulled on her gloves and waited. The hounds were on her street now, their baying loud enough to send fear skating over her skin, making her shiver. That was part of their effectiveness. Their howls alone were enough to bring some people to their knees. She was made of sterner stuff, but that didn't mean she wasn't affected. It only meant she could talk her brain out of a visceral reaction. But she sure wished they'd shut the fuck up. It was giving her the creeps, making her look over her shoulder, as if one of the great beasts could somehow vault to the roof and materialize right behind her to rip her apart. She shook herself slightly. That wasn't going to happen. The howls changed to excited yips as the hounds picked up her fresh blood scent. Casey waited. Would they take the bait? The yips rolled back into howls, and the sound of their hunt grew slowly muffled. Her ploy had worked. All that was left was for her to slide down the rope, free fall the last few feet into a dumpster of dubious safety, then climb out and steal a car. And all with only one good arm. Piece of cake. Slinging the pack over her bad shoulder, she grabbed the rope with her other gloved hand, then swung herself carefully over the side, and let herself go. This was going to hurt. If Damian had working lungs, he'd have been holding his breath. The grip of the woman's hand had seared like a brand into his flesh, her blood soaking into the aged stone of his arm. The once hard surface, now made soft and porous after centuries of exposure to every kind of weather imaginable. The woman's plea had followed hard on her touch, heating the trail of her blood as it sank into the walls of his confinement. A wisp of long-forgotten warmth bathed his bones as his blood began to flow, joining with the woman's until every second that ticked past brought a fresh agony of invigorated muscle and flesh. He welcomed the pain as he would an old friend. After centuries of feeling nothing, of being forced to watch the world go by without so much as the sun's heat penetrating his stone prison, this agony was as joyous as the light of Elysium. His lungs expanded with the first breath of oxygen he'd drawn since that long-ago moment on an ancient battlefield. So unexpected was the feeling that it shocked him at first, terrified him. It felt as if he was being ripped apart, his body unable to cope with the awakening of his flesh after all this time. And then came the pounding of his heart, so loud that he strained to turn around to see what enormous beast was coming upon him from behind. Fingers which had long rested around his sword now gripped it properly, the ridges and grooves as familiar to him as if they were part of his own hand. He lowered his gaze, and his eyes opened to the world around him. Not the inhuman, unblinking eyes of stone, which were all the world had seen of him for centuries untold. The eyes with which he'd been forced to watch as time went by around him. These were his true eyes, and he wanted to weep. But there was no time for womanly emotion. He was a warrior, and he'd been called to battle by the female, who was enough of a warrior herself that her blood had broken the curse. Wounded, but still fighting, courageous and strong. She'd freed him from this endless prison. He was honor-bound to help her. He tried to turn, to search the roof for her, but his muscles were still sluggish and awkward. It infuriated him. He'd been the greatest fighter of his time, his prowess on the battlefield unlike any other, and now that he was needed again, he creaked like an old woman. He forced himself to move, feeling fresh warmth seeping into his muscle and sinew, fresh awareness flooding his mind. He was nearly overwhelmed with sensory input, everything so much more vivid than during his long imprisonment, trapped in stone. The damp air that stank of the filth that humans took for granted as the price of civilization, the distant sound of sirens, the roar of a plane overhead, and he frowned. The baying of hellhounds? He'd not heard that sound in thousands of years, not since before he'd been cursed. He stepped down from the pedestal that had been his home, turning just in time to see the woman drop over the back of the building. He took 2 steps in her direction and heard her cry of pain, a sound even louder to his ears than the thumping of his own heart. He ran to the edge of the roof, shedding stone with every step, leaning over to peer downward just in time to hear her defiant snarl. He'd seen her break the glass across the street, seen her leave a smear of her blood, but her ploy had failed. The hellhounds raced to the Common, creeping in shadow along the side of the building, waiting for her as she climbed out of the big metal bin. The 2 beasts crouched, one on either side of her, their gruesome mouths dripping saliva, while their eyes gleamed with the fire of hell itself. She drew her weapon, but he could see the pain it cost her. He didn't know what cause she fought for so determinedly, but she was going to die if he didn't help her. He lifted his blade, exulting in the weight of it after so long. Anticipation raced through his bloodstream, energizing his muscles, shattering the last of the stone that surrounded him. Leaning over, he grabbed the rope she left behind and leapt off the roof after her. Casey bit back her cry as knives of agony stabbed through her wounded shoulder, seeming to travel in waves down her arm and over her back, tightening her muscles into spasms that only added to her pain. She struggled to breathe through the dust and dirt that filled the air of the overflowing dumpster after her fall, waiting for the throbbing to ease up enough for her to think. But the nightmare that had become her life tonight wasn't going to grant her even that. Grabbing the edge of the metal container, she rolled out onto the hard asphalt, only to find the nightmare hiding in the shadows, waiting for her. Damn, but they'd figured that misdirect out quickly. Note to self, hellhounds weren't totally stupid. She put the dumpster at her back and drew the Glock with her left hand, still gripping the strap of the backpack with her right, grateful for the rough weave that soaked up the blood without getting slick and unmanageable. She huffed a silent breath, thinking that this was what her life had come to. Gratitude for a blood-soaked strap that still worked. A soft growl had her spinning in a crouch to find one of the hounds eyeing her hungrily. She'd no sooner clocked his position than the other one showed himself, prowling out of the darkness, lips pulled back in a snarl that bared terrifying fangs below a pair of red-drenched eyes. She waited for them to come to her. The blood leaking from her shoulder should be drawing them like a magnet, sending a signal to their tiny brains that their prey was wounded, vulnerable. But they didn't move from their watchful crouches, and Casey realized something. Every instinct was telling them to attack and kill, but whoever was running them was holding them back. It was because of the talisman. It was not only valuable, but unstable. She didn't know what would set it off, and she'd bet her enemies didn't either. It could be triggered by something as ordinary as a stray bullet, or a deep graze from a hound's fang. And once triggered, it would emit an electronic pulse that could wreak havoc on today's technological society. The death and destruction could be terrible, and it would take a power much greater than she possessed to shut it down. Its potentially disastrous nature was why she'd been sent to retrieve the thing. Her boss, Nick Katsaros, ran a team that was funded by the FBI and existed solely to find and retrieve the various magical artifacts scattered throughout the world. Magic and the FBI might seem an odd fit, but it frequently made her life a lot easier. Like when she needed to slip weapons through customs, or reassure the local law enforcement that it was perfectly okay for her to engage in the breaking and entering of a private home or institution, or even the occasional gunfight. like tonight. Casey was only one of Nick's hunters, but she'd been with him long enough and had proved herself often enough that he trusted her to go after the really significant pieces, especially the ones with unknown magic. But someone had dropped the ball on this mission, because the background information they had on the collector was simply wrong. Shit. Hellhounds? And now she was crouched in an alley, with the deadly artifact that she'd stolen suddenly acting as her best defense against the very people she'd stolen it from. How fucked up was that? Her pursuers came into view behind the hounds. Nothing but flashes of movement as they kept to the shadows and doorways, mindful of her weapon. Casey scooted back a few feet until she was mostly hidden behind the dumpster. They might not want to shoot, but that didn't mean they wouldn't, especially if one of them thought he was a sharpshooter and decided to go for a headshot. She leaned out from the dumpster's cover and sighted down the alley, waiting for one of her enemies to show his face. They couldn't shoot her, for fear of hitting the talisman, but she sure as hell could shoot them. Someone moved out of the shadows, scurrying for the next cover. Casey quickly lined up her shot with both hands and pulled the trigger. The man's head exploded like a bloody melon, and he dropped to the ground. It was always best to go for a headshot when dealing with magic users. Too many of them could recover from even the most severe wound to their body. But no one could survive a hollow point to the brain, and she was a very good shot. Down the alley, one of her pursuers swore violently. "Just slide over the pack with the device," a voice called. "We don't care about you." Casey didn't waste the energy it would take to voice her skepticism. They probably wouldn't shoot her once she got rid of the backpack. They'd loose the hounds. The two beasts remained totally focused on her, snarling nonstop, their powerful muscles bunched as they fought their handler's control, waiting for the release they knew instinctively would come, the freedom to attack and kill their prey. Oh yeah, and then feed. Someone else scurried down the alley, and she fired off another shot, hitting the brick wall where her target had been only seconds earlier. Damn, she couldn't afford to waste ammo. Although for a moment, she'd actually wondered why not. She didn't see any resolution of this standoff that didn't include her dead body. She might as well take as many of them with her as she could. That didn't include the hounds, unfortunately. To some, they might seem the obvious target. They weren't protected, weren't hiding in the shadows, or huddling behind a filthy garbage dumpster. The problem was that the hounds hunted in pairs, and she could only shoot one at a time. And once she shot the first one, assuming she managed a kill shot, which was no guarantee, since their skulls were like rock, the other would go a little nuts, breaking whatever hold his handler had on him and freeing him to kill whoever struck his fancy. As the one who'd killed his partner, she'd be the first target. She wouldn't be the only one, which she might have taken some comfort in if she'd really thought there was no hope of survival. But she wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. The scrape of a boot had her turning to discover two of her pursuers rappelling down the side of the building behind her. Their ropes weren't 12 feet short either. She caught movement in the corner of her eye and spun back around to find the ones in front had moved up while she was distracted. She couldn't win this. She was one, and they were many. Damn, maybe she was going to die tonight. Fuck, she swore, not caring who heard. Fucking Nick Katsaros. This was all his fault. Instead of running around Kansas consorting with vampires, he should have been verifying the intel that sent her after the damn talisman in the first place. He'd have caught the inconsistencies, the tells that would have warned that something wasn't quite right about this job. He had a real gift for it, a knowledge that exceeded her own, and she was a fucking expert. But it was too late. The only thing he could do for her now was to attend her damn funeral. A sudden scream had her jerking back around, just in time to see one of her pursuers seemingly plucked off the wall and sent flying through the air to hit the opposite building with a sickening crunch. What the hell? A huge blond man stepped out of the alley between the two buildings and walked over to the injured man who lay on the ground groaning. Picking him up by his obviously broken arm, the blond giant held him for only a second before running him through with a big-ass sword, stabbing in below his arm to avoid the ballistic vest and right into his heart. Yep, that was another thing no magic user could survive, having his heart sliced in two. The second climber jumped to the ground and spun to fire his weapon at the newcomer, but the blonde held the body armor-wearing dead guy in front of him to absorb the gunfire as he advanced, then threw the body at the shooter, grabbed his weapon, and turned it on him, shooting him expertly 3 times, once in the head, twice in the heart. Casey stared. A triple tap? Who was this guy? But then she heard curses from the enemies still in front of her and decided it didn't matter. Whoever he was on her side, at least for the time being, and she might survive this night after all. Bullets whizzed past her position as her enemies started firing at her erstwhile ally. Casey ducked back further into the protection of the dumpster, taking advantage of the fact that they seemed to have forgotten about her. Slipping the backpack off her shoulder, she tucked it between the dumpster and the wall, then shuffled to the other end of the container until her enemies were in sight. They weren't paying much attention to her anymore. They were totally focused on taking out the blonde, stepping into the open to gain a better vantage, overwhelming him 3-1. She waited until they were just past her position, then crept out of hiding behind them and picked them off 1, 2, 3. Did she have a problem with shooting him in the back? Why, no, she didn't. As soon as they were down, she raced out of cover and over to where they lay on the ground, finishing each of them off with a bullet to the head. No telling who among them was a magic user. She was breathing hard, standing over the last dead body when a deep, rumbling growl reminded her of something she shouldn't have forgotten. The damn hellhounds were now unbound. One of these dead men had been their handler. Every instinct was screaming at her to back away, to run. But her brain was telling her that would be a mistake. She had to stand her ground, establish her dominance, or at least try to. Logically, she knew that wouldn't last. But her only weapon was her Glock, and there were those thick skulls to contend with. One of the beasts took a threatening step closer. She jerked and instinctively started to step back. "Stand your ground," a deep voice commanded. She risked a glance over her shoulder to find her new ally striding up the alley toward her. Bloody sword in one hand, an HK MP5 submachine gun in the other. Eyes on the hound, woman, unless you want to die. Casey's eyes narrowed in irritation. He might be her rescuer, but that didn't mean she had to put up with his macho bullshit. She'd kept herself alive this far, and okay, maybe there'd been a little help from him. She spun back around in time to see one of the hounds creeping close enough to reach her with a single leap. Damn. She raised her Glock. Maybe she couldn't kill it, but she could hurt it, slow it down. The other beast leapt suddenly, powerful hind legs propelling the creature 10 feet to where she stood. She swung her Glock up and fired, watching the bullets hit its massive chest and knowing it wasn't going to be enough. She'd braced herself for impact, crouching down and protecting her face, ready to grab the beast and toss him through the air. When metal flashed in the dim light and a huge fucking sword swung right over her head, slicing effortlessly through the hound's thick skin and taking off his head, Casey screamed. Not in fear, but in disgust and anger, as hot blood sprayed all over her, and the hound's head rolled to her feet. "Shit!" she hissed, but kept her eye on the remaining beast. She wasn't going to make that mistake twice. "Shall I kill that one for you also?" The same rumbling voice asked the question with a definite snarky edge. "Would you?" she asked sweetly. "I'd be ever so grateful." The blonde snorted and lifted his blade, but the second hound growled loudly and backed away. He might be without a handler, but he wasn't without a brain, no matter how tiny.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?